Yeah. Good morning, everybody. I'd like to introduce to you our speaker, who is Deaconess Joy Prim, and she is coming to us today from Hong Kong. We have this program thanks to Mitty Quinn, who had met Joy when they worked together at the General Conference for the Love Your Neighbor Coalition. So thank you, Mitty, for making this program possible. And at this point, I would like to turn it over to Deaconess Joy. Thank you.
Thank you, Shirley. And of course, thanks to Mitty for making this time together possible. And good morning, good afternoon, good evening from wherever you are joining us in the world. So I am coming to you from Hong Kong, where I currently serve as a General Board of Global Ministries missionary, working with an ecumenical non-governmental organization here, or NGO, called the Mission for Migrant Workers, which we call the Mission for short. While my deaconess appointment, I serve a dual appointment through the Order of Deaconess and Home Missioner, both my missionary assignment as well as doing human rights work for the Philippines. So today I'm excited to be with you all. We will focus majority of our time on the work I do as a missionary, and I will touch a little bit on my wider deaconess work, and then hopefully can schedule a time in the future to come back and share more about in depth about the deaconess human rights work that I do. So I am originally from the East Coast, from Western North Carolina. I grew up near Winston-Salem, and I'm a lifelong United Methodist, mainly because of United Women in Faith. I have been a member of United Women in Faith since the age of 12, and I am proud to say that. I served originally as a first time in the mission field as a young adult missionary 11 years ago through what was then known as the Mission Intern Program, which is now known as the Global Mission Fellows International Program. At the time, we served 3 years, a year and a half abroad, and a year and a half in our passport country. I served in Hong Kong originally with the same placement site. And it was here that I began to learn and find my voice and find a calling in doing solidarity work as a daily life choice. I then went back to the United States, where I served in the Los Angeles area, working with Filipino victims of human trafficking, as well as Filipino youth and students and workers fighting issues such as wage theft, and in the wider scale, working with issues of immigration and undocumented migrants and victims of human trafficking. I was there for 10 years, and in those 10 years, I finally filled out the paperwork and became a deaconess. And in 2020, I should have been commissioned as a missionary and consecrated as a deaconess at General Conference. But pandemics happened, and Global Ministries did their first ever online training and sent us out into the mission field. And the Order of Deaconess and Home Missioner also did online training and welcomed us into the order. And it was just this past April and past May that I was able to be commissioned as a missionary in the Asia Regional Commissioning held in Cambodia, finally. And then was consecrated with the historically largest batch of deaconess and home missioner candidates. There were over 60 of us consecrated at United Women in Faith Assembly in Orlando, Florida. And then I came back to Hong Kong and continued on in the mission field. And so my whole time in the mission field has been centered under a global pandemic. And so today I am excited to share with you all what it is like doing local ministry amidst a global pandemic. So I use the word global here, meaning an understanding that what happens globally affects us locally, but also the actions we take locally, especially being from the United States, impacts the global community. And so today, I will focus on the realities of the Filipino migrant domestic workers here in Hong Kong that I serve and serve alongside of. Now, I say a focus on the Filipino migrant domestic workers because here in Hong Kong, we have migrant domestic workers from multiple Southeast Asian countries, primarily the Filipino and Indonesian communities. However, I do not speak Bahasa Indonesian, and so communication can be challenging, whereas I am pretty fluent in Filipino Tagalog. And so do more one-on-one work with the Filipino community. And so today I will share with you about what is the work I do as a missionary. And so my placement site, which is known as the Mission for Migrant Workers, is the longest service provider for migrant workers in Hong Kong, going on 42 years. And we have been committed to building a caring and inclusive Hong Kong society for those 42 years. We are located at St. John's Cathedral, an Episcopal Anglican cathedral at the heart of Hong Kong, in the Central District, and are blessed to have been there for the past 39 years. Engaging in the ecumenical ministry and interfaith work allows us as an outreach ministry to be directly engaged both with the local church community and serving the migrant communities. Now, just last year, the statistics that were released, there are approximately 350,000 migrant domestic workers here in the city, and that is down over 30,000 since 2020 due to the impacts of the global pandemic. And approximately around 54% of them come from the Philippines. And in our work and in our office, we provide services to migrant domestic workers in crisis. And so I want to share a little bit about what do they experience. So in the heart of COVID-19, 9 out of every 10 complain of long working hours. Now, long working hours for domestic workers here is seen as over 14 hours a day. In Hong Kong, they work 6 days a week. They are forced to live in their employers' homes. They are not allowed to have outside accommodation and are only allotted 1 day off a week. However, due to the COVID-19 pandemic, many of them are not even given that 1 day off per week because they might catch COVID. However, they go out during the week to do the marketing, to tend to the families, and are out and about. We also see that 2 out of every 5 workers who have sought our assistance do not have a private room to rest. And this is a big piece of advocacy that we're engaged in. You see here on the upper right of your screen with the red circle, that is a cabinet. That was a domestic worker was told that was her private room. That is a cabinet above the fridge. And then the second photo here, tell you the story of Ate Grace. Ate Grace came to Hong Kong in October of 2020. She did her 14 days hotel quarantine, and her contract stated she had a private room in her employer's home. She was here to make a better life for her family back in the Philippines. And when she got to her employer's household, she was told this is her room. Yes, that is a toilet bowl. The private room she had, which she was informed was a multi-use room, was actually a bathroom. And now, mind you, this is October 2020. Where she was forced to store her belongings, to sleep on a thin yoga mat every night, and to take her meals. When Ate Grace gave 1 month notice of termination to her employer, the employer tried to put her on an airplane back to the Philippines the next night. We were able to rescue Ate Grace so she was not forced to leave the country, and assisted her in filing cases for severe violation of contract, that a bathroom or a washroom is not an acceptable accommodation, and she was able to settle with her employer for her complete contract. So she was paid, even though she only worked 2 months, her contract was paid out so she could return home and be reunited with her family. Ate Grace's story is featured in our recent publication, Between a Toilet Bowl and a Wall. This is the bathroom where she was informed was her private room. And so Ate Grace's story, sadly, is not the irregularity that we hear. Accommodations for migrant domestic workers in Hong Kong flats are small. Hong Kong homes are small. And so we see that the issues that they face have continued over the past 40 years and are able to then find and seek assistance. And at the mission, we continue to adapt our services to meet the needs of migrants of crisis in these historic times we live in. In 2021, we saw a record number, 8,400 plus migrants seeking our assistance with case supports, rights-based inquiries, and other critical services, while over 28,000 additional ones were sought services through our smaller migrant caring centers, or MCCs, that were set up in light of the COVID-19 pandemic to reach migrant domestic workers wherever they may be. And this included not only support for those who are working here in Hong Kong, but also providing support for those who were staying in government hotel quarantine. And in the height of the COVID-19 pandemic, back in February and March of this year, this included providing care packs of medicines, antigen kits, and food to over 300 migrant domestic workers in the matter of 2 weeks who tested positive for COVID-19 and had no place to go and no money or ability to access food or medicines they needed to care for themselves. And in 2021, we reached out and held 225 MCCs throughout Hong Kong. Hong Kong is primarily divided into 3 regions, with one being Hong Kong Island proper, and then Kowloon being just across the harbor from that, and New Territories being the area that borders with mainland. We've published over 11,000 pieces of information on COVID-19 in language of migrant domestic workers. Hong Kong publishes in 2 main languages, English and Cantonese, but migrant domestic workers in the city speak many, many more. They come from the Philippines, Indonesia, Thailand, Sri Lanka, Nepal, and India. And so we sought to publish materials in their languages so they could be educated on the current ever-changing Hong Kong COVID-19 situation, restrictions, and guidelines. And we worked closely with the Bethune House Migrant Women's Refuge to ensure that no migrant domestic worker in the past 3 years has gone homeless, whether that is providing shelter in the Bethune House, through other shelter partners, through coalitions, or just paying for hostels, so that every migrant domestic worker who has been terminated has a place to go to rest. But for the mission for migrant workers, it's not just about the direct services that we provide. That is a big chunk of what we do, but we also aim to build an harmonious Hong Kong, which involves doing solidarity and advancing advocacy around issues migrants face in Hong Kong and back in their home countries. In partnership with grassroots migrants organizations, we launched what was known as the #IRED movement, meaning I resist exclusion and discrimination, in May of 2021, that continues up until today. This movement was started when the government tried to make COVID-19 vaccines mandatory for migrant domestic workers to keep their contracts. Now, I am also in Hong Kong on a working visa as a missionary, and I had no such threat of that being part of my contract. And this was announced on a Friday. This also was on the day this was announced, they also declared mandatory testing for every migrant domestic worker, 300,000 plus in the city for COVID-19 because one migrant domestic worker had tested positive. One. And so over the course of the 9 days of over the course of the long weekend on May 1st and May 2nd, we saw people coming together from so many different backgrounds and so many different communities that by Tuesday, Hong Kong had repealed this policy. And so that's just one recent example of a victory that the migrant domestic workers, together with the NGOs and churches, have been able to win. Just today, as Sunday is the most common day off for migrant domestic workers here in the city, we held a walk for our living wage. For migrant domestic workers in groups of 4, because we're not allowed to gather in more than groups of 4, walked through key parts of Hong Kong, simply just to state we want a living wage. Migrant domestic workers have been under a wage freeze for 3 years and going on 3 years, and the statement on their wage salary for the coming year should have been out already, and it's not. And so they're building up this push. Currently, migrant domestic workers make around 4,600 Hong Kong dollars, which is less than 600 US dollars a month, salary to work 6 days a week. And so they're calling for a living wage, the ability not to support themselves here in Hong Kong as inflation is a reality here, just as it is back in the States, and to be able to support their families back in the Philippines. And as I mentioned and said, the work that we do at the mission isn't just about the direct services, but it's about learning from and getting to know the migrant domestic workers. And it's about understanding the connections of why they are here to begin with. The migrants from Indonesia, from the Philippines, and from the other countries are here because they have no ability to work back home. In the Philippines, there are no jobs. I have friends here who are licensed educators, who are licensed nurses, who have gone to university and gone to college, but were unable to make a living wage back in the Philippines to support themselves. Hong Kong, with no ability to work, with no jobs in their home countries, and even if they're able to find jobs, they are only contractual, meaning they work 6 months and then they're terminated. And no benefits, and the rising cost of things such as school for their children, rent, and food prices. Migrants are left with no choice but to look overseas for work. And this what is known as forced migration. In the Philippines, 50 years ago, Ferdinand Marcos Sr. declared 50 years ago this week, declared martial law, and in the years that followed, launched a labor export program in the country, or LEP. The labor export program has continued until today and forced hundreds of thousands of migrant domestic Filipino overseas workers overseas to find work. Many of them find work in the service industries, in Hong Kong, in Singapore, as domestic workers, in Japan as singers, in Korea in the factories, in Europe as nannies and au pairs, in the USA as nurses and hotel workers. Many of these women and many of these workers are women. And while in the Middle East, you also see men working in the oil fields. But the women are forced overseas to find work, simply so their their children can survive. And so we see that this is not just a violation of their rights as migrants, but this is also a violation of their human rights, and violations of conventions around the rights and the welfare of children to be together with their parents. And so in May of 2022, when I stood to be consecrated by Bishop Oliveto, I was very lucky. There were 6 bishops. I felt very blessed that Bishop Oliveto was the one who consecrated me. I was just one of a handful who wore her mask, or my mask on stage, but I did so because in Hong Kong, we are still under mask mandates. We can literally be fined $300 US if we step outside of our homes not wearing a mask. And so you see these COVID-19 policies continue to impact migrant domestic workers. The fines are $5,000. A migrant domestic worker salary is $4,630. So simply for not wearing a mask, she can get fined more than her salary. And so in doing this work and learning from the Filipino migrant leaders over the past 10 years, I have also gotten involved in human rights work, working and building solidarity for just and lasting peace in the Philippines, through the Hong Kong Campaign for Human Rights and Peace in the Philippines, which is part of a larger international coalition called ICHRP, or the International Coalition for Human Rights in the Philippines. And then through this work and doing human rights work and raising awareness, is all really motivated by what's happening to our Filipino migrants here in Hong Kong. They are speaking out, they are standing up, fighting for their rights, but also fighting for issues they are facing back home in the Philippines. Just this past May, Marcos Jr. was declared president in the Philippines by a highly questionable and corrupt elections. On election day, by an hour after the polls closed, over 90% of the precincts had transmitted their results. Philippine Wi-Fi is horrible. It is horribly slow. Whereas in Hong Kong, we have 100 actually, I have 1,000 megabytes Wi-Fi, which is 3 times faster than I could ever have in the United States. And Hong Kong had not yet even transmitted their results yet. And so through the highly questionable election, Marcos Jr. was declared president. And before the final vote was even declared, US President Biden had called Marcos Jr. and congratulated him on his win. And here in Hong Kong, migrant domestic workers have been speaking out and have been red tagged or terror tagged, supposedly connected to the armed terrorist in the Philippines. And yet they continue and refuse to be quiet. They have been harassed, they have been surveilled. Many cannot go home out of fear of being arrested at the airport, while their families and loved ones back in the Philippines face harassment and attacks. And it is not just the migrant Filipino migrants here in Hong Kong that have been impacted. I have friends in the United States who face similar attacks, who have been red tagged and labeled as terrorists. And just in 2019, Brandon Lee, a Chinese American human rights defender from San Francisco, who was doing paralegal work in the Philippines, was shot by the Philippine military. Thankfully, he survived, and we were able to airlift him out of the Philippines back here to the United States, as he is a United States citizen. And as he continues to rehab, he has lost all movement below his shoulders. And yet, when the Secretary of State and even President Biden met with representatives of the Philippines, and the Secretary of State went to the Philippines, they refused to talk about human rights, and they refused to ask about updates on what is happening to Brandon. And so we see these direct connections. And in Hong Kong, migrants continue to work around and work within the COVID-19 restrictions here, to speak out, to raise their voices, and to fight for the rights of migrant domestic workers, against overcharging, against fees, and against things that they are experiencing, while also building solidarity amongst migrant communities who are directly facing similar issues here in Hong Kong, but are also facing issues back, human rights violations, no work, back in their home countries. And so in HK CART, we decided last year and started recording for a documentary featuring the stories of red-tagged overseas Filipino workers. This documentary, Migrant Women Rise, highlights the realities, the impacts of red tagging on two migrant women leaders who are Filipino domestic workers here in Hong Kong, who have both been accused of being members of the New People's Army, the armed guerrillas who are fighting in the mountains of the Philippines. They are domestic workers here in Hong Kong. Both have been here for over 20 years and serve local families, while also organizing and fighting for the rights of their fellow migrants. And so this documentary traces their day-to-day life, both in their week-by-week life, both as a domestic worker and also a community organizer with their fellow migrants during the global pandemic. And so to bring it back directly to the global, into the United States, we also have to acknowledge that our US tax dollars are funding the Marcos Jr. government without accountability, without any audits, without any proof that they are not being used to commit human rights violations. And so ICHRP globally and ICHRP in the United States, along with many other organizations, both Filipino and non-Filipino, led and have put forth in Congress the Philippine Human Rights Act. This act was spearheaded after the attempted assassination of Brandon Lee. And it calls for the suspension of US aid to the Philippine military and police until such a time that it is proven no US funds or equipment have been used to kill or commit human rights violations, and all state forces have been brought to justice. If our US tax dollars are going to build health centers and provide medicines and build schools or bridges, we would have a very different stance on this, but they're not. They are funding the Philippine police, which is globally known for their alleged war on drugs, which in all reality is a war against the poor, and the Philippine military, which has been documented by the United Nations and committing countless human rights violations. And so as the Representative Wolf from Pennsylvania, when she introduced this in a press conference, said, this is not about foreign involvement. This is about holding our government accountable for where our US tax dollars are being spent. And in an ever-changing world of a global pandemic, here are a couple ways we can answer the call to care for our neighbor. As a United Methodist missionary, I only do what I do as the hands and feet of the United Methodist Church through prayers and through support. I have a blog. It gets pretty regularly updated. You can also from there follow and join my newsletter listserv. And as a United Methodist missionary, we fundraise through our advanced projects numbers. This project number 3021344 not only supports my ability to stay in the mission field, but it supports other missionaries, especially those who are not from the United States, ability to stay in the mission field. The United Methodist, the General Board of Global Ministries is one of a handful of missionary sending agencies who does not require you to fundraise your salary before you can enter the mission field. And we also send our missionaries from everywhere to everywhere. This is a rarity in the world today. And so donating to a missionary advance number supports not only the missionary whose number it is, but it supports our missionaries from the Philippines who are serving in countries such as Taiwan and Laos here in Asia. It supports missionaries throughout Africa serving around the continent, providing vital services in communities who don't have the same financial support networks that missionaries based in the United States do. It's supporting in the work that we do in the office. To be quite honest, we're still in the depths of the COVID-19 pandemic over here in Hong Kong. We still have mask mandates, and literally tomorrow, we finally get rid of hotel quarantine. Tomorrow, folks. And so the reality that of needing masks and sanitizers are still not provided by employers of migrant domestic workers blows my mind. 3 years into a global pandemic, to enter a school, to work in a church, to enter into a restaurant, certain restaurants, you have to take a rapid antigen test every day. These expenses go, while they are readily available here, these expenses add up. And so we continue to provide mask sanitizers and antigen tests to our migrant domestic workers, especially those who are living in our shelter pursuing justice in their cases. So you can both donate through our office online, or if you want the tax deductible in the United States, you could donate through our advance number through the General Board of Global Ministries. 100% of what comes through our advance comes to us here in Hong Kong and goes directly to sheltering and providing food and basic needs to terminated migrant domestic workers. And of course, you can always invite me back to share more about the human rights work that I do and to show and host a viewing of our Migrant Women Rise documentary. So trying to encapsulate the work that we do, this brings to a time of question and answer. I thank you everybody for listening and invite you to write your question down. If you don't want to be recorded saying it, put it in the chat, or feel free also to unmute and just ask your questions.
Thank you, Joy, very much. We're going to start with questions and comments from people who are here in person, and then we will check and see if people who are on Zoom have any questions or comments. I will ask you, Joy, to repeat the question. I think you'll be able to hear it well, but we will try to make sure that the sound gets recorded. So first, from people who are here in person, Martha.
Do I need a mic?
Joy, can you hear the person speaking?
I think I can hear her, yes.
Okay.
How long will you be in Hong Kong with this appointment? Or do you know yet? Or what's the rule?
And so repeating it.
So how long will I be serving under this appointment? So as a deaconess, our appointments are every year. As a missionary, I signed a 3-year contract in 2020, which will expire next year. And I am in the process of renewing that contract for another 3 years serving here in Hong Kong.
Okay, thank you. Joe, I think.
Thank you very much for the presentation. Very helpful. I don't know if you know Mark Shelton. You run into him. He was a United Methodist missionary assigned to the Yale program in Hong Kong, which you may or may not be affiliated with. I'm just curious to know who makes the decisions in Hong Kong? Does Beijing make the decisions in Hong Kong? And if people do mobilize and try to tighten the regs and implement some sort of protection for migrants, who are you turning to? You turn to the Hong Kong government? You turn to Beijing? What do you do?
So the question being, who makes the decisions in Hong Kong? So actually, to touch on, do I know Mark? 10 years ago, the Hong Kong Methodist Church celebrated their 100th anniversary. So this is when I was here the first time. And they flew in missionaries who had served in Hong Kong throughout those 100 years. And so I did meet Mark over breakfast 10 years ago at that event. We called it an extended family reunion. Who makes the decisions? When it comes to on paper, Hong Kong determines its own local policy, its own local governance. When it comes to foreign policy, it is part of Beijing, just as is Macau, another special administrative region. So when it comes to advocating for issues of migrants' rights, living wages, the ability to make live out an option, so migrant workers and their employers can decide the best living situation for them, we advocate and push the Hong Kong government on these issues. The other part of that question, I am currently living in China, friends. There is something here known as the national security law. And when I am back in the United States next year, I would love to come visit in person for itineration and answer that question more in depth at that time.
Okay, let's find out if there's any other question or comment from people who are here in person. See if I see any hands here. If not, I will turn and find out if anybody on Zoom would like to unmute and ask a question or make a comment. Okay, right now, people have been, I think they're absorbing what you have said to us, Joy. One more here. Yes, go ahead.
I just want to say thank you for the presentation that you've given us. You're doing amazing work, it sounds like, and we would love to have you come visit Dumbarton when you're itinerating back in the U.S. The amazing issues that the Filipino women and other workers need to put up with, or have had to put up with.
Okay, I'm going to repeat that one because I'd like to endorse it as well. Thank you for the presentation today. And we want to have a further presentation from you, possibly while you are still in Hong Kong. You will be contacted about that. And then also when you're back in the United States to hear from you under those circumstances. So, Joy, thank you very much for your presentation today, for the thoughts you have given us. And we look forward to being further in contact with you.
Thank you all. Thank you for having me. I look forward to staying in touch. And while I'm still here, and should Global Ministries approve a full itineration in 2023, I look forward to visiting you in person as well at that time.
Thank you. Okay, we'll end the program at this point. Thank you.
Thank you.